It was June 24, 1948. The office was deep inside the Soviet Military Administration headquarters in Karlshorst, a commandeered mansion in the eastern sector of Berlin. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and old paper. Outside, through the tall windows, the ruins of the German capital stretched in every direction, broken concrete and twisted steel monuments to the war that had ended 3 years earlier. Inside, at a heavy oak desk, Colonel Sergei Tulpanov sat reviewing intelligence reports. The typewriter keys clacked in the outer office. A telephone rang somewhere down the hall. Tulpanov was the deputy chief of the Soviet Military Administration's Information Department, a man who understood power not through tanks and artillery, but through leverage and pressure points. On his desk sat a single-page memorandum from Moscow. The order was simple, elegant, and in his professional judgment, absolutely foolproof. At midnight tonight, all road and rail traffic into the western sectors of Berlin would cease. No trains, no trucks, no barges on the canals. The technical justification cited bridge repairs on the Autobahn, mechanical failures on the railway lines, concerns about black market smuggling. But Tulpanov knew the real reason. The Americans, British, and French controlled 3 small islands inside the Soviet occupation zone, sectors of Berlin surrounded by 200 kilometers of Soviet-controlled territory. 2.5 million Germans lived in those western sectors. They needed food. They needed coal, they needed medicine, and now they would have none of it. The blockade was not an act of war. It was a chess move, a quiet, bloodless application of geographic reality. The Western Allies would face a choice: abandon Berlin or start World War III. Tulpanov stubbed out his cigarette and allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Within 3 months, perhaps less, the Americans would negotiate. They would make concessions on German reunification, on reparations, on the new West German currency that Moscow found so threatening. Or they would leave. Either way, the Soviet Union would win. What Colonel Tulpanov did not know, what no one in Moscow's ministries or military headquarters could have predicted, was that the Americans would choose a third option. An option so ambitious, so logistically audacious, that Soviet planners would initially dismiss it as a bluff. An option that would transform an isolated city into a symbol, a blockade into a humiliation, and the very act of feeding people into a weapon that would reshape the balance of power in Europe. The option was simple to state and seemingly impossible to execute. They would supply an entire city by air, from the sky, every day, for as long as it took. The Soviet leadership laughed. Then they watched, and within months, that laughter died in their throats as they witnessed something they had never imagined possible. American industrial and logistical power turned into a precision instrument, landing aircraft every few minutes, 24 hours a day, delivering more cargo by air than had ever moved by ground. The Berlin Airlift was not a military operation. It was a demonstration, a proof of concept, a message written in the sky in contrails and cargo manifests. And it terrified the people who had started the blockade, because they suddenly understood what they were facing, not just wealth or technology, but a system that could mobilize, sustain, and execute the impossible as a matter of routine. If you genuinely value carefully researched historical stories told with this level of detail and accuracy, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of work truly resonates with you. Chapter 1. The City of Ruins and the 3-Sector Anomaly. Berlin in 1948 was a corpse. The city that had once housed 4 million people, the capital of the Third Reich, the seat of Hitler's Thousand-Year Reich, was now a landscape of rubble stretching in all directions. 75% of the city center had been destroyed by Allied bombing and Soviet artillery during the final apocalyptic battle for the city. Entire neighborhoods existed only as outlines in the dust, foundations where apartment buildings had stood, empty lots where factories had hummed with the machinery of war. The Reichstag was a burned shell, its dome collapsed, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes. The Brandenburg Gate stood intact but isolated, a triumphal arch leading nowhere, surrounded by flattened blocks where the government quarter had once stood. The smell, witnesses recalled, was omnipresent and inescapable. Plaster dust that hung in the air with every breeze, sewage from broken pipes that leaked into basements and flooded streets, and beneath it all, the faint, sickly sweet odor of bodies still buried in the ruins, casualties of the final battle or victims of the chaos that followed. People lived in cellars and basements of bombed-out buildings, in makeshift shelters constructed from broken bricks and scavenged timber. They draped canvas over holes where roofs had been. They boarded up windows with wood and cardboard. Children played in bomb craters that had become small ponds, oblivious to the danger of unexploded ordnance. Old women picked through rubble with practiced hands, searching for anything useful: an intact cooking pot, a piece of copper wire that could be traded, a single unbroken window pane. The official ration in the winter of 1947 to 1948 was 1,550 calories per day, barely enough to sustain life, far below what a person needed to work or stay healthy. People were starving, not in the dramatic sense of mass death in the streets, but in the slow grinding erosion of health and hope. Tuberculosis was epidemic, spread by overcrowding and malnutrition. Infant mortality was soaring. The weak and elderly died quietly in unheated rooms. This ruined city had been divided, carved up by the victorious Allies at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945. The division followed military realities. The Red Army had taken Berlin in brutal house-to-house fighting in April and May 1945, suffering over 80,000 casualties in the final assault. Beaver, the fall of Berlin 1945. By the time American and British forces reached Germany's western borders, the Soviets were already occupying the capital, but the Allied agreement called for joint occupation, a four-power administration. Berlin would be split into four sectors: Soviet, American, British, and French. The problem was geographic. Berlin sat 170 kilometers inside what became the Soviet occupation zone of Germany. The western sectors of Berlin, the American, British, and French zones, were islands, isolated enclaves surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory. This was not an oversight. It was deliberate. Stalin believed that this geographic vulnerability would give Moscow leverage. The Western Allies would be dependent on Soviet goodwill for access to their sectors. Roads, railways, and canals all passed through Soviet checkpoints. If that access were cut, the Western position in Berlin would become untenable. And yet, from the Soviet perspective, the situation was also deeply frustrating. Berlin was supposed to be jointly administered, but in practice, the city had become a showcase of competing systems. In the Soviet sector, factories were being dismantled and shipped east as reparations. Printing presses, machine tools, entire railway locomotives were being loaded onto trains bound for the USSR. The communist-controlled Socialist Unity Party, the SED, was consolidating power through intimidation and rigged elections. In the western sectors, by contrast, the Americans and British were pouring in aid. Food shipments were arriving, schools were reopening, democratic political parties were organizing. The western sectors were becoming, in Soviet eyes, a thorn, an advertisement for capitalism lodged deep inside the socialist world. Worse, they were becoming an escape route. Germans fleeing Soviet control could simply walk across the sector boundary into the American or British zones, and from there make their way west to safety. By 1948, thousands were leaving every week. The immediate trigger for the blockade was currency reform. On June 18, 1948, the Western Allies announced the creation of a new currency for their occupation zones, the Deutsche Mark. The old Reichsmark was worthless, destroyed by hyperinflation. The new currency was backed by genuine economic reform and American aid. It was intended to stabilize the West German economy and lay the groundwork for a new West German state. To Moscow, this was a direct provocation. A separate West German state meant the permanent division of Germany. It meant the loss of any hope of a unified, Soviet-aligned Germany. It meant that the economic recovery of Western Europe would proceed without Soviet control. Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky, the Soviet military governor of Germany, did not wait for lengthy consultations with Moscow. On June 24, he issued the order. All land and water routes into West Berlin were severed. The official explanation was technical difficulties. The Autobahn bridge at Helmstedt needed emergency repairs. The railway lines were experiencing signaling problems. The canal locks at Peretz required maintenance. But everyone understood this was a blockade, a siege, an attempt to force the Western powers out of Berlin through starvation and economic collapse. The Western Allies faced an immediate crisis. They had 13,000 troops in Berlin, surrounded by 300,000 Soviet soldiers. They had no stockpiles. The city consumed, on average, 4,000 tons of supplies per day: food, coal, medicine, raw materials for the few functioning factories. The British and American military governors in Berlin, Sir Brian Robertson and General Lucius Clay, met in emergency session. The options were grim. Option 1, withdraw, abandon Berlin, and accept a humiliating defeat. Option 2, send an armed convoy through the Soviet blockade, a clear act of war that would trigger World War III. Option 3, negotiate, accept Soviet terms, and compromise on West German sovereignty. General Clay, a hard-nosed combat engineer who had built supply lines across France during World War II, proposed a fourth option. He cabled Washington with a one-sentence message that would change history. We can haul in supplies by air. Clay, Decision in Germany. Chapter 2. The Arithmetic of the Impossible. The proposal to supply Berlin by air was not, at first glance, insane. It was simply impossible. The numbers made that clear. West Berlin needed 4,000 tons of supplies per day to survive at minimal subsistence levels. To thrive, to maintain industrial production and prevent economic collapse, the city needed closer to 5,000 tons per day, the largest cargo aircraft available to the USK. Air Force in 1948 was the Douglas C-54 Skymaster, a four-engine transport that had been the workhorse of the wartime airlift over the Himalayas, the famous hump route that supplied China. A C-54 Skymaster could carry 10 tons of cargo. Basic arithmetic: to deliver 4,000 tons per day would require 400 flights per day, 400 takeoffs, and 400 landings, every single day. At two airfields in West Berlin, Tempelhof in the American sector, and Gatow in the British sector. Chapter 2: The Arithmetic of the Impossible. The proposal to supply Berlin by air was not, at first glance, insane. It was simply impossible. The numbers made that clear. West Berlin needed 4,000 tons of supplies per day to survive at minimal subsistence levels. To thrive, to maintain industrial production, and prevent economic collapse, the city needed closer to 5,000 tons per day. The largest cargo aircraft available to the U.S. Air Force in 1948 was the The airlift skeptics, and there were many, pointed out several fatal problems. First, weather. Berlin's weather was notoriously foul. Fog, rain, snow, ice. For 6 months of the year, flying conditions were marginal at best. The aircraft would be operating on instruments, landing blind in soup. Second, aircraft availability. The U.S. Air Force had demobilized rapidly after World War II. Most of its transport fleet had been mothballed or sold as surplus. The planes that remained were scattered across the globe, supporting occupation forces in Japan, the Philippines, and Western Europe. Assembling 400 transport aircraft would require stripping every other command of lift capacity. Third, maintenance. Aircraft operating at this tempo would break. Engines would fail. Hydraulic systems would leak. Structural fatigue would appear. There were not enough mechanics, not enough spare parts, not enough maintenance facilities to keep a fleet this size flying around the clock. Fourth, crew fatigue. Pilots and loadmasters would be Flyugless C-54 Skymaster, a four-engine transport that had been the workhorse of the wartime airlift over the Himalayas, the famous hump route that supplied China. A C-54 Skymaster could carry 10 tons of cargo. Basic arithmetic: to deliver 4,000 tons per day would require 400 flights per day, 400 takeoffs, and 400 landings, every single day. At two airfields in West Berlin, Tempelhof in the American sector, and Gatow in the British sector, the most damning critique came from the professionals. The Air Transport Command, the organization responsible for military airlift, had run the numbers. Their official assessment, delivered to the Pentagon in early July, concluded that a sustained airlift could deliver, at most, 1,000 tons per day, perhaps 1,500 in ideal conditions, far short of what Berlin needed. The Soviets, reading the same reports through their intelligence networks, reached the same conclusion. The airlift was a bluff, a face-saving gesture that would last a few weeks before the Americans admitted defeat and came to the negotiating table. Soviet military intelligence estimated the operation would collapse by autumn, when bad weather made instrument flying too dangerous. Colonel Tulpanov filed reports noting that the airlift was already straining Western resources. Accidents were occurring. Planes were being cannibalized for parts. It was, he concluded, only a matter of time. What the Soviets missed, what almost everyone missed in those early days, was that the Americans were not planning a conventional airlift. They were planning something unprecedented. They were going to industrialize the sky. General Clay had placed the operation in the hands of a man uniquely suited to the task. Major General William H. Tunner, the commander of the Military Air Transport Service. Tunner was not a fighter pilot. He was not a bomber commander. He had never flown combat missions or won dogfights. His specialty was logistics. He had run the hump airlift over the Himalayas during World War II, delivering supplies from India to China across some of the most treacherous terrain and weather on Earth. That operation, at its peak, had delivered 70 to 1,000 tons per month. Tunner had learned two critical lessons from the hump. First, heroics were the enemy of efficiency. Pilots who improvised, who flew by instinct, who took risks, created chaos. What worked was routine. Rigid, boring, repetitive routine. Second, an airlift was not an Air Force operation. It was a factory. The product was ton miles. The assembly line was the air corridor. Every element, from loading to flying to unloading, had to be standardized, timed, and optimized. Tunner arrived in Germany in late July 1948 and immediately began to dismantle the ad hoc airlift that had been running for the first month. He observed the operation with cold, analytical eyes and saw waste everywhere. Pilots were landing, shutting down engines, leaving their aircraft to get coffee, to smoke, to chat with ground crews while cargo was unloaded. Some flights were carrying 8 tons, others 12, depending on how the loadmasters felt that day, on how carefully they had packed, on whether they had skipped items to save time. Some aircraft were taking off when they were ready, others when the pilot decided the weather looked acceptable. There was no system. There was no standardization. There was no rhythm. It was, in Tunner's professional judgment, amateur hour. He had seen this before, on the hump, where individual heroics and pilot initiative had created chaos and inefficiency. The hump had eventually been tamed through the same method he would apply in Berlin, the ruthless elimination of variation. Tunner instituted a system. He wrote it down in a document that became legendary in Air Force history, studied and analyzed for decades afterward, the standard operating procedures for the Berlin Airlift. Every aircraft would carry exactly the same load, 10 tons in a C-54 Skymaster, distributed to precise weight and balance specifications. Every flight would follow exactly the same route, outbound from bases in West Germany along one of 3 air corridors at a specified altitude, inbound along the same corridor at a different altitude. Every aircraft would be separated by exactly 3 minutes. If a pilot missed his approach at Tempelhof or Gatow, he would not circle. He would not make a second attempt. He would return to base with his cargo and try again on the next flight. This no second chances rule was draconian, but it was essential. Circling aircraft created chaos in the stacked pattern of incoming planes. One missed approach could ripple through the system, delaying dozens of flights. Tunner calculated that it was more efficient to waste a single load than to risk disrupting the rhythm. Ground operations were re-engineered with the same ruthless efficiency. The moment a C-54 landed and taxied to its unloading spot, precisely marked with painted lines on the tarmac, a ground crew of 12 men would swarm it like a pit crew at a race. These men had trained for weeks to perfect their choreography. They had exactly 15 minutes to unload 10 tons of cargo and refuel the aircraft. Not 16 minutes, not 14 and a half. 15. The timing was everything. The crew chief would have a stopwatch. 2 men would chalk the wheels. 4 would open the cargo doors and drop the ramps. 6 would form a human chain, passing cargo bags and sacks hand to hand to waiting trucks. Simultaneously, a fuel truck would connect to the aircraft's wing tanks, pumping aviation gasoline at maximum safe flow rate. The pilot would remain in his seat, engines running at idle, monitoring. A mobile snack bar would pull up to the aircraft door on a precise schedule. Coffee in a thermos cup, a sandwich wrapped in waxed paper. A weather update printed on a card with the latest ceiling and visibility reports for the return flight. No delays, no wandering off, no breaks. As soon as the last cargo bag came off and the fuel hose disconnected, the ground crew chief would give a thumbs-up signal. The pilot would advance the throttles. The aircraft would taxi for takeoff. The aircraft would be airborne again in 30 minutes from the moment its wheels touched down. 30 minutes, gate to gate. This was not normal. This was not how air forces operated. But it worked. By late August, the airlift was delivering 2,000 tons per day. By September, 3,000. The Soviets watched with growing unease. This was not supposed to be possible. Chapter 3. Coal, Flour, and the Logistics of Survival. The cargo manifest of the Berlin Airlift was a snapshot of human need reduced to weight and measurement. Food, flour, dehydrated potatoes, powdered milk, powdered eggs, lard, sugar, coffee, salt, each item precisely calculated to provide calories and nutrition with minimum bulk. Coal, anthracite coal in burlap sacks, 200 pounds per sack, 50 sacks per C-54, stacked by hand by loadmasters who returned to base each night black with coal dust embedded in their pores, their uniforms stiff with grime. Medicine, penicillin in small vials that meant the difference between life and death for Berliners with infected wounds, vaccines to prevent epidemics in a city where sanitation systems had collapsed, insulin for diabetics who would otherwise slip into comas. Raw materials, machinery parts for Berlin's surviving factories, newsprint for the city's newspapers, chemicals for water treatment plants that struggled to provide clean drinking water to millions. At the peak of the operation, the airlift was delivering 13,000 tons per day, enough to supply not just subsistence rations, but something approaching normal civilian life. Bakeries could produce fresh bread, factories could resume limited production, schools could heat their classrooms. This required a logistics network of staggering complexity, a supply chain that extended from farms in Bavaria to coal mines in the Ruhr to warehouses in Berlin, all synchronized with flight schedules and cargo capacity calculations. Consider flour. Berlin's bakers needed 1,000 tons of flour per day to produce bread. Flour is a fine powder that creates explosive dust clouds. Loading it onto aircraft required specialized handling. The Americans built a flour mill at Berlin Air Base in West Germany, grinding wheat into flour and packing it into multi-wall paper sacks designed to contain the dust. The sacks were loaded onto aircraft using conveyor systems and secured with cargo nets. The British, whose sector of Berlin was supplied primarily through Gatow Airfield, developed a different system. They flew in whole grain and built a mill in Berlin to grind it locally, reducing the weight of the airlift cargo and providing employment for Berliners. By December 1948, Berlin's bakers were producing more bread than they had before the blockade. Coal was the critical challenge. Berlin needed coal for heat, for cooking, for electricity generation. In winter, the city required 6,000 tons of coal per day. Coal is heavy, dense, and filthy. Loading it onto aircraft was back-breaking labor. American ground crews at Rhein-Main and Fassberg air bases worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, filling burlap sacks, hauling them up ramps, stacking them in aircraft cargo holds. The work was brutal. Men suffered hernias, back injuries, crushed fingers. The coal dust was everywhere, in their lungs, in their uniforms, in their food. And yet, the coal kept flying. By January 1949, the airlift was delivering enough coal to keep Berlin warm through one of the coldest winters on record. The aircraft themselves became consumables. C-54 Skymasters were not designed for this kind of punishment. They were cargo haulers built for long-distance flights with maintenance intervals measured in weeks. Under airlift operations, they were flying 8 to 10 missions per day, landing on runways in all weather, subjected to constant loading and unloading stress. The aircraft were, quite literally, wearing out. Engines reached their overhaul limits. Airframes developed cracks. Hydraulic lines failed. Tunner implemented a maintenance system modeled on automotive assembly lines. Aircraft needing inspections or repairs were pulled from the flight rotation and sent to dedicated maintenance facilities. At Oberpfaffenhofen and Burtonwood air bases, mechanics worked around the clock, replacing engines, patching fuselages, overhauling landing gear. The goal was a 200-hour inspection cycle. Every aircraft, after 200 flight hours, would receive a complete mechanical inspection. Anything worn or damaged was replaced. The aircraft were then returned to service. At peak operations, the maintenance system was processing over 100 aircraft per month. The human cost was equally real. Fatigue was the constant enemy. Pilots were flying multiple missions per day in marginal weather conditions. The approach into Tempelhof was particularly notorious. The airfield sat in the heart of Berlin, surrounded by apartment buildings. The final approach required threading between 4-story tenements, dropping the aircraft through a narrow corridor with no room for it. Pilots called it the dive into Tempelhof. At night, in fog, on instruments, it was terrifying. Mistakes were made, aircraft crashed. The first fatal accident occurred on July 25, 1948, when a C-47 Dakota flew into a hillside on approach to Tempelhof, killing both crew members. More accidents followed. By the end of the airlift, 72 people had died, 31 Americans, 39 British, and 8 Germans, U.S. Air Force Historical Study. Each death was a reminder of the stakes, of the pressure, of the fact that this operation was being conducted at the absolute limit of what was possible, and yet the operation continued. The rhythm became routine. Every 3 minutes, another aircraft appeared on approach. Every 3 minutes, another load of coal or flour touched down. The sky over Berlin was never empty. At night, Berliners could hear the constant drone of engines, a sound that became known as the Symphony of Freedom. Children gathered at the end of Tempelhof's runway to watch the planes come in, so close overhead that they could see the pilots' faces in the cockpits. The airlift was becoming something more than a logistics operation. It was becoming a symbol. Chapter 4. The Soviet Miscalculation and the Growing Dread. Inside Soviet headquarters in Karlshorst, the reports arriving from observation posts around the western air corridors were creating consternation. The numbers didn't make sense. In July, the airlift had delivered 32,000 tons. In August, 69,000 tons. In September, 90,000 tons. The curve was not leveling off. It was accelerating. Each week brought new records, new peaks that Soviet analysts had assured their superiors were impossible. Soviet air defense officers filed incident reports describing flight patterns that seemed impossible. Aircraft arriving at 3-minute intervals 24 hours a day, in perfect weather and in blinding snowstorms. The discipline was unnerving. The Americans and British were not deviating from their flight paths, not responding to provocations. not reacting to buzzing by Soviet fighters who would roar past their cockpits at close range. They were simply flying, endlessly, methodically, like machines. Soviet fighter pilots, veterans of the Great Patriotic War who had flown combat missions against the Luftwaffe, reported that the airlift crews showed no emotion, no hesitation. They maintained their 3-minute spacing with such precision that Soviet controllers could set their watches by the arrivals. This was not normal human behavior. This was something else, something that Soviet military psychology had not accounted for. The systematic application of industrial discipline to human operations. Colonel Tulpanov's confident assessments from June and July were being quietly revised. The airlift was not collapsing, it was succeeding. The question that haunted Soviet planners was simple and terrifying. How were they doing this? The Soviet Union's own air transport capability was a fraction of what the Americans were demonstrating. Soviet military doctrine emphasized fighters and bombers, not cargo planes. The few transport aircraft in Soviet service, primarily Lisanov Li-2s, copies of the American Douglas DC-3, were used sparingly. The idea of flying thousands of sorties per month, in all weather, to supply a single city, was beyond Soviet logistical imagination. They could not have done it. They could not have sustained it. And yet the Americans were doing it, and making it look routine. The Soviet leadership faced a strategic dilemma. The blockade had been designed as a pressure tactic, a way to force negotiations without triggering war. But it was failing. West Berlin was being supplied. The Western Allies were not withdrawing. The blockade was, in fact, strengthening Western resolve and providing a massive propaganda victory. Newspapers across the free world were publishing stories of American pilots risking their lives to feed Germans, the same Germans who had bombed London and enslaved Europe. The moral narrative was clear. The Soviets were starving civilians. The West was saving them. Stalin's advisors presented him with 3 options. First, escalate. Shoot down an airlift plane. Force the crisis to a head. This option was rejected immediately. Firing on unarmed transport aircraft would be an act of war, and Stalin was not ready for World War III. The Soviet Union was still recovering from the devastation of World War II. The Red Army was powerful, but the United States had atomic bombs. The risk was unacceptable. Second, interfere with the airlift through nonviolent means. Buzz the cargo planes with fighters. Conduct military exercises in the air corridors. Jam radio frequencies. Create navigational hazards. Some of these tactics were tried. Soviet fighters did harass airlift planes on occasion. Searchlights were used to blind pilots on night approaches. But the Western pilots adapted. They filed complaints, documented the incidents, and continued flying. The airlift did not stop. The third option was to wait. The Soviets convinced themselves that winter would succeed where summer had failed. Berlin's weather from November through February was brutal: freezing rain, heavy snow, persistent fog. Instrument flying conditions. Icing conditions. The Americans and British would not be able to maintain the tempo. Aircraft would ice up and crash. Visibility would drop to 0. Runways would become unusable. The airlift would grind to a halt, and the blockade would win by default. Soviet military intelligence prepared detailed weather analyses predicting that the airlift could not sustain operations at more than 50% capacity during winter months. This would be enough to prove the operation unsustainable. The Western Allies would finally be forced to negotiate. What the Soviets did not anticipate was the Western response to the winter challenge. The Allies did not scale back operations. They expanded them. A third airport was constructed in the French sector of Berlin, Tegel, built by Berliners working in volunteer shifts, clearing rubble, laying runways, constructing navigation towers. Tegel opened in November 1948, adding a third pipeline into the city. The Americans brought in additional C-54 Skymasters, stripping them from every available command. The British deployed every transport aircraft they could muster, including the massive Handley Page Hastings, a 4-engine cargo plane that could carry 13 tons. Navigation systems were upgraded. Ground-controlled approach radar, a wartime invention, was installed at all 3 Berlin airfields, allowing controllers to guide aircraft down through zero-visibility conditions by watching them on radar screens. Pilots practiced instrument approaches until they could fly them in their sleep. The winter months of 1948 to 1949 saw the highest accident rate of the airlift, but they also saw the highest tonnage delivered. In January 1949, the airlift delivered 170,000 tons. In February, 150,000 tons. The daily average never dropped below 4,500 tons. By early 1949, the Soviet position was untenable. The blockade was not working. Berlin was not starving. The western sectors were, if anything, more stable than they had been before the blockade began. The airlift had become an economic engine, Berliners were employed unloading cargo, maintaining facilities, building the new airport. The city's morale had transformed from despair to defiance, and the propaganda damage was catastrophic. The Soviet Union was being portrayed worldwide as a bully, a tyrant, a regime that would starve women and children to achieve political goals. The Western Allies were being celebrated as heroes. This was not the narrative Moscow had intended. The blockade had become a humiliation. Chapter 5. The Easter Parade and the Final Reckoning. April 16, 1949, was a clear spring day over Berlin. The weather was perfect, the kind of flying conditions that pilots dream of. Unlimited visibility, calm winds, blue skies stretching to the horizon. General Tunner had been planning for this day for weeks, sketching out schedules, calculating fuel consumption, wargaming every possible bottleneck. He called it the Easter Parade, though it fell on a Saturday. The goal was simple and spectacular: to demonstrate, beyond any doubt, beyond any possible Soviet counter-argument, that the airlift was not just surviving, but dominating. Tunner wanted to set a record that would send an unmistakable message to Moscow, to Washington, to the world. For 24 hours, the airlift would operate at maximum surge capacity, the absolute limit of what the system could sustain. Every available aircraft would fly. Every crew would be scheduled. Ground crews would work without breaks, operating on coffee and adrenaline and the knowledge that history was watching. The target: deliver 12,000 tons of cargo in a single day, double the normal daily requirement for the entire city, triple what Soviet intelligence had predicted was possible, even in ideal conditions. No transport operation in history had ever moved that much cargo by air in 24 hours. No one had even attempted it. The operation began at midnight. At Rhein-Main, Fassberg, Wiesbaden, and Celle air bases in West Germany, C-54 Skymasters lined up on taxiways, engines running, cargo loaded. The takeoffs were synchronized. Aircraft lifted off at 90-second intervals, tighter than the standard 3-minute spacing. The sky over Berlin filled with aircraft. At Tempelhof, Gatow, and Tegel, the scene was controlled chaos. Ground crews unloaded planes with stopwatches in their pockets, competing to see who could turn around an aircraft fastest. The record, set that day, was 7 minutes from touchdown to takeoff. Coffee and sandwiches were delivered to pilots without them leaving their seats. Cargo was stacked in warehouses faster than trucks could haul it away. The aircraft kept coming. The rhythm was hypnotic. The roar of engines, the screech of tires on runway, the clang of cargo ramps dropping, the shouts of loadmasters, the whine of engines spooling up for takeoff. Every 90 seconds, another plane. The final tally, recorded at midnight on April 17th. 12,940 tons delivered in 1,398 flights, nearly 13,000 tons, more than 3 times the city's daily requirement. More cargo moved by air in 24 hours than anyone had thought possible. U.S. Air Force History Office, Berlin Airlift. Tunner sent the numbers to Washington in a terse cable. The message was clear: the airlift could deliver, at will, more supplies than Berlin could consume. The blockade was not just defeated, it was irrelevant. In Moscow, the reports of the Easter Parade operation reached Stalin's desk via military intelligence channels. The numbers were verified by Soviet observers in Berlin who had watched the operation with their own eyes. The conclusion was inescapable. The Americans had turned logistics into a weapon. They had demonstrated an industrial and organizational capacity that the Soviet Union could not match. The blockade was not applying pressure. It was advertising Western superiority. On May 4, 1949, the Soviet Union and the Western Allies reached an agreement. The blockade would be lifted on May 12. In exchange, the Western Allies agreed to a Council of Foreign Ministers meeting to discuss the German question. It was a face-saving formula. In reality, it was a Soviet surrender. At 1 minute after midnight on May 12, 1949, the barriers on the Autobahn and railway lines were raised. Truck convoys rolled into West Berlin for the first time in nearly 11 months. The blockade was over. The airlift continued. Tunner did not shut down operations the moment the blockade ended. He had learned the lesson of preparation. The airlift continued at reduced capacity through September 1949, building up stockpiles in West Berlin: coal, food, medicine. If the Soviets reimposed the blockade, the city would have reserves. By September, Berlin had a 6-month supply cushion. Only then did the airlift officially end. The final flight landed at Tempelhof on September 30, 1949. In 15 months, the combined American and British airlift had delivered 2.3 million tons of cargo in 277,000 flights. Berlin Airlift Historical Foundation. The cost: $150 million in 1949 currency, roughly $1.7 billion in current dollars. 78 lives lost. The blockade had cost the Soviet Union something far more valuable: credibility. Chapter 6. The weapon they didn't see coming. The Berlin Airlift was a military operation, but its most powerful effects were not military. It was a demonstration of capability that changed how the world understood power. The Soviets had believed that geography was destiny. They controlled the land routes into Berlin, therefore they controlled Berlin. This assumption was rooted in centuries of military logic. Armies march on roads, supplies move by rail and canal. Seize the infrastructure, control the flow of goods, and you control the outcome. The airlift shattered this logic. Geography was not destiny when you could fly over it. Infrastructure was not a bottleneck when you could build a pipeline in the sky. The American achievement was not primarily technological. The aircraft used in the airlift, C-54 Skymasters and C-47 Dakotas, were wartime designs. The navigation systems were basic. The radios were standard military issue. What was revolutionary was not the hardware but the system, the ruthless standardization. The factory model applied to flight operations, the logistics network that treated aircraft as interchangeable units in a production line. This was not something the Soviet command economy could replicate. Soviet industry excelled at mass production of simple, robust systems: T-34 tanks, MiG fighters, Kalashnikov rifles. It was built for quantity over flexibility. The airlift required something different: coordination across services, adaptation in real time, empowerment of junior officers to make decisions on the spot. American loadmasters, sergeants in their 20s, were authorized to reconfigure cargo loads to balance aircraft weight and ensure maximum efficiency. Soviet logistics operated on top-down planning, with decisions made at headquarters and executed by subordinates. The cultural difference was the weapon the Soviets had not seen coming. The airlift also revealed the strategic value of air mobility. Before Berlin, air transport was seen as a niche capability, dropping paratroopers, evacuating wounded, supplying isolated outposts. The airlift proved that air mobility could sustain entire populations, supply armies, project power across hostile territory without firing a shot. This lesson was not lost on American military planners. The U.S. Air Force began investing heavily in strategic airlift capacity. The Military Air Transport Service, Tunner's command, became the blueprint for a global logistics network. Tanker aircraft for air refueling, cargo planes with intercontinental range, airlift doctrine that emphasized rapid deployment and sustainment, all of these emerged from the Berlin experience. By the time the Korean War began in June 1950, American forces were able to deploy to Korea, halfway around the world, with a speed and efficiency that stunned adversaries. The logistics lessons of Berlin had been institutionalized. For the people of West Berlin, the airlift was transformative. At the start of the blockade, Berliners viewed the Western Allies with ambivalence. These were the nations that had bombed their city, killed their families, destroyed their country. But the airlift changed that calculation. American and British pilots were risking their lives, flying through storms and ice, to bring food and coal to German civilians. The symbolism was powerful. One of the most famous moments of the airlift involved an American pilot, Lieutenant Gale Halvorson, who began dropping candy attached to tiny parachutes to children gathered at the end of Tempelhof's runway. Other pilots joined in. The candy drops became a sensation, covered by newsreels and newspapers worldwide. Halvorson, nicknamed the Candy Bomber, became a folk hero in Berlin. The gesture was small, almost trivial in the context of a massive airlift delivering thousands of tons of coal and flour. But it was deeply human. It said, "We see you, we care. This city matters." The political consequences rippled across Europe. The blockade had been intended to prevent the creation of a West German state aligned with the West. It achieved the opposite. West Germans, watching the airlift, concluded that their future lay with the Americans and British, not with the Soviets. The Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was formally established in May 1949, during the final weeks of the blockade. Its constitution was written. Its first elections were scheduled. The division of Germany, which the Soviets had sought to prevent, became permanent. The blockade had guaranteed the outcome Moscow most feared. More broadly, the airlift demonstrated that the United States was willing to commit resources and take risks to defend allies. This was not abstract. It was concrete, visible, undeniable. European leaders, particularly in France and Italy, where communist parties were strong, took note. The Marshall Plan, the American program to rebuild Western Europe, gained credibility. If the Americans would fly coal into Berlin for 11 months, they would follow through on economic aid. The airlift became the proof of American commitment that words alone could not provide. Chapter 7. The Scoreboard and the Permanent Shift. The final accounting of the Berlin Airlift is not written in cargo manifests or flight logs. It is written in the choices that followed. The Soviet Union never again attempted to blockade West Berlin. The threat was implicit, the geography unchanged, but the tactic was discredited. Any future blockade would face the same response, an airlift. And now the world knew it could be done. The Soviets knew it could be done. The advantage of the blockade as a leverage tool had evaporated. In 1961, the Soviets would build the Berlin Wall, sealing off East Berlin to prevent the hemorrhage of refugees fleeing to the west. But they did not blockade the western sectors. The wall was an admission of weakness, a confession that the Soviet system could not compete with the West without physical barriers to prevent people from leaving. The airlift's lessons extended far beyond Berlin. In strategic terms, it validated air power as a tool not just of destruction, but of construction. The United States built its Cold War military posture around rapid deployment and global reach. The C-130 Hercules, the workhorse transport of the late Cold War, was a direct descendant of the lessons learned over Berlin. The C-141 Starlifter and C-5 Galaxy, massive long-range cargo aircraft, were designed to project power by delivering entire combat units anywhere in the world on short notice. Soviet planners, by contrast, remained wedded to ground-based logistics. Their military doctrine emphasized rail transport and road networks. They built massive supply depots and pipeline systems. They could move armies across the Eurasian steppe, but they struggled to project power globally. When the Soviet Union intervened in Afghanistan in 1979, their logistics were road-bound. They relied on convoys vulnerable to ambush. The contrast with American operations in Vietnam, supplied by air despite hostile territory, was stark. The Berlin Airlift also marked a turning point in public diplomacy. The operation was covered extensively by journalists from around the world. Newsreels showed American and British pilots delivering coal to German children. Radio broadcasts featured interviews with Berliners thanking the Allies. The narrative was simple and powerful. Democracy delivers. It was a narrative the Soviet Union could not counter. Soviet media tried to portray the airlift as a propaganda stunt, a temporary measure doomed to fail. When it succeeded, Soviet credibility suffered. The lesson for Western leaders was clear. Visible, concrete actions shaped perceptions more effectively than speeches or diplomatic communiques. The airlift was soft power backed by hard logistics. For Berlin itself, the airlift became the founding myth of the city's modern identity. West Berlin, surrounded by communist East Germany for 4 decades, defined itself as the outpost of freedom. The city's survival, its refusal to surrender during the blockade, its faith that the Allies would not abandon it, these became core elements of civic identity. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1980, the airlift was invoked as proof that tyranny could be overcome, that geography was not destiny, that logistics and will could triumph over military force. The Airlift Memorial at Tempelhof, a 3-pronged structure representing the air corridors, stands as a monument not to war but to perseverance. Its inscription reads simply, "They gave their lives for the freedom of Berlin." The statistical record of the airlift remains staggering even by modern standards. 2.3 million tons delivered by air, 277,000 flights, 1 aircraft landing in Berlin every 3 minutes at peak operations, not for days or weeks, but for 15 months. In 1948 and 1949, this was science fiction made real. Today, with modern cargo jets and sophisticated navigation systems, duplicating the Berlin airlift would be difficult. The discipline, the coordination, the sheer sustained effort required to maintain such an operation for over a year would strain any military. That it was accomplished with 1940s technology, by crews learning the procedures in real time under the pressure of a Cold War crisis, remains one of the great logistical achievements in military history. The Soviet failure was not a failure of intelligence. They had the data. They knew the capabilities of the C-54 Skymaster. They understood the weather challenges. They calculated the tonnage requirements. What they failed to grasp was the will to execute and the culture of adaptation that underpinned Western military logistics. Soviet doctrine was rigid, plan-driven, hierarchical. American doctrine, shaped by the exigencies of World War II, emphasized flexibility, initiative, and logistics as the foundation of military power. The Americans had learned, in the Pacific and European theaters, that wars were won not by heroics, but by supply chains. The Berlin Airlift was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. It was logistics weaponized. When Colonel Sergei Tulpanov filed his final report on the blockade in May 1949, he acknowledged the failure but attributed it to factors beyond Soviet control: Western obstinacy, unexpected American investment, favorable weather during critical periods. He did not acknowledge the deeper truth. The Soviets had underestimated their adversary. They had assumed that the Americans, spoiled by wealth and democracy, would lack the discipline and endurance to sustain a grinding logistical operation. This was the fatal miscalculation. The Americans had both wealth and discipline. They had turned industrial capacity into a precision instrument. They had demonstrated that the air could be controlled as effectively as land or sea, and they had done it while the world watched. The laughter that began in that Moscow briefing room in June 1948, the confident assumption that geography and necessity would force the Americans to withdraw, had died long before the blockade officially ended. It died with the first week of sustained airlift operations, when Soviet intelligence officers realized the flights were not tapering off but intensifying. It died when the tonnage curves kept rising instead of collapsing, defying every prediction, every calculation, every assumption about what was logistically possible. It died during the Easter parade, when 13,000 tons were delivered in a single day, more cargo than many small nations imported in a month. It died in the eyes of Soviet officers who watched the aircraft stream into Berlin hour after hour, day after day, and realized they were witnessing something their system could never replicate. The mystery that Soviet intelligence had failed to solve was not a technological secret that could be stolen or copied. It was a cultural reality, an organizational philosophy, a way of integrating human initiative with industrial process. The Americans had built a system that could do the impossible as a matter of routine, and in the ruins of Berlin, with every cargo plane that landed, the balance of power in the Cold War shifted. The Soviets had started the crisis believing they held the leverage. Confident that geography and necessity would force concessions. They ended it, understanding they were facing an adversary whose strength they had only begun to comprehend. The blockade had been designed to demonstrate Soviet power and Western weakness. It achieved the opposite. It revealed that the true superpower of the Cold War was not the one with the most tanks or the largest army, but the one that could turn logistics into a precision weapon, that could sustain the impossible, that could feed a city from the sky.